just because you have an understanding of the Bible in your head doesn't necessarily mean that you have Jesus in your heart.
Get right, get inside, get hungry, got appetite. Everlasting water, never get thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey.
You are listening to Chad Schaefer on Disputed Lands.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. If you're continuing in the marathon, if you're just getting here, welcome. We are in, I can't tell you which one. We're probably in 6 or 7 videos in now to our marathon. If you're just joining us, you are going to want to take note of the web address scrolling now across the bottom of your screen. That is dailyrenegade.com. Dailyrenegade.com. As you guys know who have been watching today, and we are raising money for Josh and Christina Peck. As some of you know, many of you may know, their son was diagnosed with cancer about a year ago, and since then, it's been a long journey for them already. They've still got a ways to go, and as a body of believers, what we need to do is we need to rally around this couple. And if we can help them out, alleviate a little bit of the burden from them, if we can, show the love of Christ to one another. And that's what we're doing. So you'll want to go to dailyrenegade.com, find the donate button. Should be right there, easy to find. And you'll want to give. If you give $1, $5, $100, or if you're able to, even more. We've not set a cap or a target on this, because if I did, you guys would meet it and stop giving. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to try to exceed any expectations we may have had. If you want to give anonymously, there will be a GoFundMe link underneath this video. I believe you can give anonymously through the GoFundMe link. Just remember, if you give via the GoFundMe, they do take a cut. So not everything you give goes to the Pecks. So that's what we need to do. That's what we're about. But this hour, we have our special guest, as you could probably seen in the title, a returning guest to Disputed Lands, no stranger to this channel. If you guys are watching, my good friend, my brother, comrade, Doug Woodward. Doug, welcome to Disputed Lands once again, brother.
Great to be with you. I always enjoy our chats, and you ask great questions, and it's usually it's a great time for me, and hopefully the viewers will have a good time too.
Well, yeah, you've always been challenging to us, and that's what I really like about you. You do put me in mind of our mutual friend Doug Krieger quite a bit. Not afraid to tackle topics and maybe rustle and rile a few feathers anyway in the process, all for the point of getting people to think, maybe re-examine what they thought they know, and perhaps they can come away with some different information that will help them out along the way. The last time we had you on there, we had you discussing rebooting the Bible, and this was part 1. And you told us you were going to be working on a part 2, and that's underway, isn't it?
Very, very much so. By the time that that we have this show on the air, I hope to have it all but finished, and all but finished. I have written 5 chapters, anticipate 7 in total, and we're going to talk about one of the earlier chapters tonight on Nimrod. I thought that might be something that that your viewers would enjoy, and
absolutely.
But I'll kind of walk people through what all the book's going to be trying to do, and then we'll dive into Nimrod to point out some of the examples of what I'm trying to accomplish with the book.
Absolutely. When we talked about rebooting the Bible part 1, you had put forth a couple major things that come to my mind right off the bat. The first one being the timeline. Tell us a little bit about that. Refresh our memory for those who may not have caught that one.
I also have puppies in the background, so it may be best for me to exit the studio momentarily and put the puppies outside.
Sure. Go right ahead.
All right.
While you're doing that, I will do my best, and then you can correct me when you get back.
All right, I'm going to leave the studio and I'll come back in about 1 minute. All right.
All right, sounds
Very
good.
good. Thank you.
Yep. All right, so the rebooting the Bible part 1. What I remembered about the timeline, Doug's premise on this essentially is that the timeline that is used a majority of the time, you're talking about Bishop Usher and those, actually in the Masoretic text actually differs from that which is found in the Septuagint being the Greek version of the scriptures, written approximately 300 BC. This was written by the 70, hence the Septuagint, authors in Alexandria, Egypt, taken from the known text, the Hebrew scriptures that were written then and translated then into the Greek in Alexandria. I believe it was under one of the Ptolemies that did this. And in essence, what Doug was saying then is that the Masoretic text had a lot to do with coming out much later in time, and a certain rabbi perhaps might have fudged it a little bit. And why would he have fudged the Masoretic text? Well, because they didn't want it to point to the Messiah. If the dating was left intact from the Septuagint, then it would clearly point to the time of the Messiah having come, and they, of course, had rejected him, and they didn't want to do that. So all the verses, not all the verses, but many of the verses were actually changed, so that they changed names and places and times to perhaps different things in the scriptures. Doug Woodward will have to refresh my memory on that just a little bit better. And they didn't want it pointing to the Messiah. This is the biggest thing. And there he is. I'll bring him back in the studio. He is back.
I am back. I have two new additions to the family to report. Two Maltipoos, crosses between Maltese and Poodles, and they are extremely cute. They're 6 months old, and they are totally a mess. But anyway, they're now outside enjoying a bully stick, so hopefully they will not be disturbing us any longer.
Well, that's wonderful. I was just telling everybody that was with us, there were 2 points that I remember very clearly from the scripture. Is that was one, that the Septuagint, which came out, I believe, some 300 BC, is that correct?
Oh yeah, that's about right. 280 BC.
280 BC.
When the Pentateuch was finished. Yep.
Right. That's when it came about. It was written down in Alexandria by the 70 that were gathered there. Perhaps. And that the other one, and I couldn't remember his name. The priest or the rabbi at the time, Akiba, much later, who was responsible for what we would call the Masoretic text. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that he had probably good reason, according to what you're arguing, to play with it a little bit. Not only the dates that the Septuagint put forth, but also some of the verses might have messed with them, all for the purpose of hiding the Messiah.
That's correct. Yes, the Septuagint was translated. The Pentateuch was translated around 280 BC. Most of it was completed by about 200 BC. There were a few books that were finished a little bit later than that. All of them were finished about 130 to 150 years before Christ. And that, we think of First and Second Maccabees, the tales of of the Maccabean revolt and leading up to Hanukkah and all that. That's all part of the Septuagint. Septuagint is really the Bible of the Greek Orthodox Church. It's always been that. It was for a long time the Bible of the Roman Catholic Church up until about the 5th century, when Jerome built the Vulgate, which was a Latin version that was taken from the Hebrew. Unfortunately, the problem was that Jerome took the Hebrew that Rabbi Akiva had created, you might say, the master copy of around 120 BC, excuse me, 120 AD, which means that the authentic Hebrew that the Septuagint had used was 400 years earlier. And I argue that's really the authentic, despite the fact the Septuagint is Greek, that it conveys many of the authentic verses of the Hebrew more authentically, more correctly than does the version that Akiba created 400 years later. Unfortunately for us Protestants, it's that Akiba version that has become our Old Testament, and the Septuagint is only now beginning, through efforts of mine and some other folks, to be reconsidered as, in fact, perhaps containing a more accurate rendering of what was originally written in the Hebrew. And as you said, Chad, the issues where the changes are really made have to do with the nature of the Messiah, his person, his mission, and the nature of the salvation that he brought. Those are the kinds of verses that are changed. And also we have the chronology of Genesis 5 and 11. By the way, how bad is the dog barking in the background?
You're fine.
Am I good?
We're good.
We're good with that. Okay. And so the chronology of Genesis 5 and 11 is changed, plus about I'd say 4 dozen other verses that all pertain to prophecies about the Messiah. The point being is that Akiva and the other rabbis that he was leading at a school in what's known as Jamnia or Javne, they were changing the Bible because they didn't like the idea that this renegade group called the Christians were basically taking Judaism away from the Jews and creating a new religion.
Right. And the reason it's ended up with us is because the KJV was essentially taken from both the Latin Vulgate and what is known as the Textus Receptus as the primary source materials for those scriptures to be written. So Doug's premise is, if they started from even honest scholars doing the best they could have been led astray by faulty initial translations. Now, reiterating, this does not mean that the KJV is not something that could be trusted or looked to or referenced. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying that there are certain aspects of the KJV, such as the time of the dating, and certain verses that may not be as clear, specifically regarding the dating, for sure.
Right.
But the other verses that we mentioned, a dozen or so, or a couple dozen or so more others that point to the Messiah, some of the words or wording was changed that does not allude as clearly to the Messiah as you will find in the Septuagint.
And where this becomes real clear is in the New Testament, because the New Testament quotes the Greek Septuagint. And so, because it was the same type of Greek, Koine Greek, as the New Testament was written in, probably only the Gospel of Matthew was actually written in Hebrew. Otherwise, everything was written in Greek. Of course, Matthew was eventually translated into Greek, and that, worked its way down to the Textus Receptus. But anyway, the point being is that if you've ever wondered why it is, when you look at the New Testament quote from the Old Testament and you go look up the Old Testament in the King James Version, you're going to see that it doesn't read the same as the version in the New Testament in many instances. And that's because 90% of the time, the New Testament was quoting the Septuagint, and the New Testament was written roughly and completed roughly 20 to 50 years before Rabbi Akiba changed the Masoretic text. And so I tell the whole story in Rebooting the Bible, in another book I wrote called A Biography of the Christian Bible. And we're focusing now on part 2 of Rebooting the Bible, and which really is going to deal with how the chronology, once we understand the chronology, how it changes the stories materially in Genesis 1 through 11.
I'm really glad we got to do a second shot at this, Doug, and I'll tell you why. I'm just kind of giggling inside here. is I think we did a much better and cleaner job of explaining that here in 5 to 10 minutes than we did perhaps in our wrap up of that
Perhaps
first
so.
interview.
Yeah.
I thought that was really clear for folks to follow.
Well, probably I had more and more practice to kind of hone it down and get it really, concise.
That was fantastic. So,
good. Thanks.
With that information in mind, I asked you to send me a little bit. That's what happens when you have friends like Doug Woodward. You get to see some things perhaps before a lot of other people do, and
that's right.
It's just like you get a birthday presents or whatever here and there throughout the year. And I got another present the other day in the mail, and that was chapter 3, where we're going to talk about where this chronology issue can perhaps mess in a major way up with the timelines that others have put forth, and synchronize actually better with what archaeologists and folks are finding in history. This chapter is titled, is chapter 3 from his book that's forthcoming called Hunting, unless he changes it, of course, which being the author, he's allowed to do.
I like it. If you like it, I like it.
Well, I do like it. Hunting the mighty hunter, Nimrod. So it's hunting and then in quotes, mighty hunter, Nimrod.
Yes. Nimrod,
all right,
mighty hunter.
That's right. You start this off with this question. Why does the story of Nimrod upset the conventional chronology? Go.
Yes. Well, once you understand that Nimrod is in the Old Testament, the King James Version, and in the book of Jasher, that we discover there that Nimrod is supposedly a contemporary with Abraham and Abraham's father. In fact, supposedly in the book of Jasher, his father Terah was like the army general responsible for Nimrod's army. But if you look at the chronology of the Septuagint, you realize that Nimrod was probably dead and gone at least 500 years before Abraham was born. And so that being the case, it would suggest that a lot of what we believe about Nimrod turns out to be legendary and fictional. And a lot of it is because of how the book of Jasher and its assertions about Nimrod, how it has become thought, it's sort of become the way we understand Nimrod and the Tower of Babel and so forth. And as I go in this chapter, what I do is I point out the chronology, why that changes things. And I seek to identify from an archaeology standpoint why Nimrod does fit a figure we know as Gilgamesh in archaeology, Mesopotamian archaeology. And then, of course, I go on to point out why there's hundreds of years and many other biblical patriarchs between Nimrod and Abraham. And it's quite a long story, because I had to actually separate the whole thing of the Tower of Babel from Nimrod, because the Tower of Babel itself is there's a lot to that story. But the main point that I make, which is going to raise some eyebrows, is that Nimrod was not the leader of the rebellion at the Tower of Babel.
Yeah, and you are pretty forthright in saying so right up front. You said, I have made it very clear. My essential thesis is that the literalist, biblical history is greatly harmed, listen carefully, folks, due to the fake history arising from the corrupted Hebrew Bible. And so if you are going to be a literalist, Doug and I clearly are literalists.
Yes, in a historical sense, more
literal than many others, which is why I believe I can win him to my other arguments privately. But
we'll see.
we'll see. But on the because Doug and I probably agree on 99.8% of just about everything he talks about. And when you read this, I ask people to do what I have always done. When you're reading any material that goes in the depth of research, as Doug does, and he provides great resources and references for everything that he's put forth in this book, just as he did the part 1 of this series. You don't have to take Doug's word for it. You can go read the white papers, the references, and everything he has to say for. And like Doug has also said, maybe this is the first you have heard of it, but he's not the only one making the points that he's making in this book. He's just putting it together in a cohesive format so that you can read it from a Christian perspective, all together along with his thesis. So, all that to say, this may anger some of you, but don't run away screaming and mad until you've given it a fair review, a fair shaking, and listen to what he's trying to say, because he just may change your thoughts on this topic. So
that's right. So let me quickly say, I believe in the plenary inspiration of Scripture. I believe in its inerrancy, but I do take the sort of classical evangelical approach, which is to say that the autographs of the authors, the original writing that they did, is what was inspired, so that what they wrote was perfectly what the Holy Spirit wanted them to write. But I also recognize, and I explain this clearly in the book, A Biography of the Christian Bible, is that despite the fact that there have been changes made during the transmission of the text, there have been corruptions that have entered in and so forth, it does not change the message of the Bible. The Bible's message and the facts presented in the Bible, theological as well as historical, remain true. The problem that I'm really pointing out in chronology is that because the rabbis took out about, well, I argue they took out 1,386 years out of the chronology of the Septuagint. And once you take that time out, it causes you to compress all of the lives of those Old Testament patriarchs from Shem all the way down to Abraham. So essentially you have, as a quick reminder, you have 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and you have 10 generations from Noah down to Abraham. And what the traditionalists, those that support the King James Bible, believe is that there really isn't any compression in chapter 5 as far as the total length of time, but there is compression in the chapter 11, and you get all of a sudden you get all these I'm visualizing like a Gantt chart. You get all these lives, and they begin to overlap. So pretty soon, what you see and the book of Jasher tends to influence this as well, is that you see that when Abraham is born, not only is Shem still alive, but Noah is still alive, and that Abraham purportedly goes and learns about the nature of God from Noah himself. And then when he is being chased by Nimrod, supposedly, he goes and he hides out at Shem's place. So you've got this tremendous compression, and it's all because the rabbis took out so much time out of the chronology, and they did this for several reasons, but mostly what they were trying to do was invalidate the candidacy of Jesus to be the Messiah. In short, what it amounted to was that during the time, leading up to the time of Jesus's coming, there was a common understanding that the Messiah was going to come 5,500 years from Adam. From the birth of Adam until Messiah would be 5,500 years. And so what the rabbis did was they went in and they started changing, not the total lifespan, but they happened on a process of changing the years when one of the patriarchs gave, as they say in the Old Testament, brought forth his son, which in the event of, let's say, Adam with Shem, that the King James would say that Adam was 130 years old when Shem was born, whereas the Septuagint would say 230 years. And that same process happens a dozen times throughout those chronologies. And what that does is it compresses the time so that when the King James Version is looked at, and James Ussher, Bishop James Ussher from the 17th century, his information is looked at, it suggests that Adam was created and the creation was in 4004 BC, and that the flood happened in 2348 BC, and the Tower of Babel, it's only approximate because the scripture doesn't give us the exact date, but it was about 100 to 120 years later according to the Masoretic text, the King James Version. So that would make the Tower of Babel event about 2200 BC. Now, the Septuagint, what it does is it says creation and Adam were created approximately 5500 BC, 5500 BC. There was 2,260 years from that time until the flood. The flood occurred, according to my calculations, in 3358 BC, almost exactly 1,000 years earlier than what the King James Version says and what Bishop Ussher says. And then the Tower of Babel happened approximately 200 years later rather than 100 to 120 years later, which resolves some of the problems in terms of the population having been big enough to actually do a project like the Tower of Babel. But that occurred at that time. And then Abraham isn't born until, I believe it's 2180. I have to go back and double check that. But in other words, Abraham isn't born for another 1,000 years. Whereas in the book of Jasher, Abraham is basically on the scene when the Tower of Babel happens. And so a lot of what I do in this particular chapter is I go through and I point out all of the contradictions in the book of Jasher. So for those of you that like the book of Jasher and you love the fact that it gives you all these dates when things happened, it's all fiction. It was written about 700 years ago, and it was written for people like us who like to find out if there's more information than what the Bible tells us. But what it comes up with is not accurate. It is fictional.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I wanted to point out of what you said, and then in addition to, so essentially what he said is from the time of the flood to the time of Babel, according to the Masoretic text, there's only 150 years. Now think about this,
or
folks.
less,
or less. All life wiped out, even if you consider it only a localized flood and not a worldwide flood.
Correct.
I want you to think, even if they're producing like rabbits, how many people could be produced in 150 years?
Right.
You're talking, even if they're having children as soon as they turn able to have children, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say this is at 14, and they're having twins.
Yeah, and the women are giving birth when they're 13 years old.
Right, giving birth at 13, 14 years old, and perhaps they're having twins each time they give birth.
Right.
You still in 150 years, 10 generation twins each can still barely fill a stadium.
Yeah, it would have a hard time even filling a 70,000 person stadium if it was really, and to be real precise, it is about 100 to 120 years, because every time you add another 10 years, it really does make a big difference exponentially in the numbers.
Right. So mathematically,
yeah,
the point is,
it's mathematically, the Masoretic text would allow only a few thousand persons to have been born after the flood. Right, after they came off the ark, whereas the Septuagint allows that to be basically hundreds of thousands of people.
Much greatly expanded. And what he didn't say here that we said in the other interview is also the great frustration which causes many academics, whether you worldly or not, it causes them to toss out the scriptures as being authentic based on Masoretic and Textus Receptus because of this dating issue. The facts that they find based on dating, trying to date and put things in chronology and next to what the scripture had to say have been totally off. So you've either had people from the scriptures trying to justify the dating, come up with all kinds of theories as to why the dating Uh, it's been a mess. It's been a
Yeah.
and
Yeah, just
that's just the honest truth of it. Any honest Bible scholar will tell you that it's been a mess, and
it just doesn't
it's
hold
caused
up.
trouble. It's caused trouble.
Yeah.
However,
Yeah. Yep.
if you go with the Septuagint dating,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these issues that they have simply disappear or are become much fewer and harder to argue with.
That's correct. Yeah. So what I attempt to do is I attempt also in the book to align the findings of archaeology and Egyptology with the Septuagint's chronology, because the neat thing is when you do that, they line up. For the most part, they line up. There's a couple of problems with Egyptology, which I explained in Rebooting the Bible Part 1, that explains why the Egyptologists say that the first dynasty was roughly 3100 BC, when we actually know, based upon a variety of things that they made mistakes on, that the Bible actually sets correct.
Namely, the names of the kings.
The names of the kings, who was really the king at the time of the flood, and the dynasties, and when was the first Pharaoh, who's known as Narmer or Menes, when was he? And long story short is that a person much smarter than me, Barry Sutterfield, did a great job laying out this information. And so instead of the first dynasty being around 3100 BC, it's around closer to about 2780. So it's about 250 years earlier. Again, that's one of the adjustments. And so once you do that, just to summarize, once you do that, you can synchronize. And I'll just throw out real fast. The reason we know about Mesopotamian archaeology is because we have literally 1 million cuneiform tablets from the 3rd millennium that predate the flood, according to the Masoretic text, by hundreds and hundreds of years. And you also have markers, and you have buildings, and you have all these things. In fact, they're all called artifacts, and they all predate the flood according to the Masoretic text and the King James Bible.
Which makes more sense, that the reason there are so many
conflicts,
writings and everything anyways, because there must have been a great civilization established that could have produced such things. Now, this goes into kind of where we're going next, and the question that this chapter actually introduces us to: just who in fact was Nimrod, and what does archaeology say about him?
Right. Yeah, there's actually, it's really a great story when you actually understand that the rebellion at Babel probably was led not by Nimrod, but by his father, by Cush, and what are known as the Cushites. They're also known as Kish in some of the Akkadian records and so forth. But it was likely the rebellion was on the plain of Shinar. It was probably focused primarily by the Hamites, of which Cush was a son of Ham and so forth. And so that lineage was probably the focal point of Babel. And the reason the Tower of Babel was built was in part to express the supremacy of the Hamites over the Shemites and the Japheth's lineage. So in effect, what was going on was that the people, the lineage of Ham, was saying, no, we don't believe that Noah's curse against Ham and against Canaan is going to suffice. We believe we can be superior. We are not going to be the slaves. We are going to be the masters. And so it is more likely that it was the Cushites and some of the Canaanites and so forth that were working together to create a rebellion. And but the Tower of Babel does happen, and they do get scattered. And as it turns out, to go further now, Nimrod, his family they leave Shinar. They eventually take boats and they creep right along the coast of the Sinai Peninsula, and they come around and they eventually land where today's Sudan is. and they become the kings of Africa, essentially. And so a number of the offspring, they become the kings of Ethiopia, Sudan, and another one of the offspring of Ham becomes Misraim, and Misraim is in fact the father of the Egyptians. And so you have the Hamites basically taking over Africa. Now, what happens with Nimrod appears that the rebellion has occurred. It's now been a couple of hundred years. Nimrod is now fully grown, and he's very rebellious in nature. He's probably taken over. He has 6 brothers or 5 brothers. He's probably conquered their lands in Egypt and in Libya and in Sudan. And he now begins to decide he's going to go back to the land of Shinar, and he's going to conquer that land because his father failed, but he's not going to fail in a rebellion. He's going to go back. He conquers the 4 cities in the south, right? The old cities of Uruk and Ur and so forth. And then those cities probably have already been built, and they're already probably populated. But after he conquers them, then he goes on to build the cities in the north, which are kind of in the border between what is today's Iraq and Syria, such as I want to call it Nimrod and Kalna and several of the other cities that are mentioned, Nineveh being probably the most important one. Nineveh was named after Ninus or Ninurta or Nimrod. And so he builds those cities. So what happens is that Nimrod actually was the world's first emperor. He was the emperor of all of Africa that had been settled at that time and the Middle East, right? And so he was responsible. Now, what had also happened is that one of the other offspring from Canaan, Sino, had actually gone ahead and moved away from that area, and he becomes the father of India and eventually of China. And so this all happens. But what we learn is that all these civilizations, they all, according to archaeology, they all commence at about the same time, roughly 3000 BC, all over the world. So clearly something happened in the middle of the world to explode the peoples apart and to cause them to scatter. And then they are very intelligent now. This is not Cro-Magnon man. These are, as it's called, Homo divinus. These are the humans that have a divine image of God. They're very smart. They begin to build civilizations all over the world at about the same time. And these, of course, happen roughly 700 years to 800 years before the date of the flood, according to the Masoretic text, which is why the Masoretic text is wrong about the chronology.
It really does make sense as well, because if you look at them, they're saying it's hard to rectify the flood dating and the Babylon dating together. It's just, there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's just very hard to rectify those two.
Correct.
And many of the other, I've read some who ascribe that dating appeared on the time without providing much reference material to those civilizations starting at the same time because of the flood, or which is what gives credence to a localized flood, and that's why they scattered, and we see them starting at that same time. But again, you don't have to do any of this. You don't have to make any of those stumblings if you start to.
I still believe. I believe in a global flood.
Yeah.
So I believe the Tower of Babel did happen. I believe there was a Nimrod. All of those things, I think they're all true. The problem is that they get all smooshed together in the chronology of the Masoretic text, what the King James Bible has, and they're properly separated in the Septuagint's chronology. And so once you have that, all of these stories really begin to change. Just like I've told you the story of Nimrod, and how all of a sudden, once we know these things, we begin to realize, well, Nimrod couldn't have done that. And the stories told about Nimrod in terms of his death and and his challenges to Abraham. All of that couldn't have happened. It had to be legend that was created really only a few hundred years ago.
So the point is that there's much consistently in the records stretching from Egypt to China to disregard near simultaneous starts, as Roll has put out. And there's good authority to back that up.
Yeah, that's the archaeologist David Roll, who was the archaeologist of the people that have seen patterns of evidence. That has the wall of time, and talks about when the Exodus occurred and all that, which I think is right on. And that's one of the arguments I make, of course, as well in Rebooting the Bible Part 1, is that the Exodus occurs approximately 200 years before the conventional view, which again is the view, from the Masoretic text, and I lay out, of course, in Rebooting the Bible Part 1, all of the sort of scientific reasons and scriptural reasons why the Exodus occurred a lot earlier than what convention would have it.
The bottom line is, as you point out, and this is a subtitle within that chapter, is that the testimony of archaeology tells the time frame of Babel and Nimrod.
It does.
Yeah.
Once we get these dates synced up with the chronology, then all of a sudden we begin to look at the details of the stories. We begin to see, can those details be the way they were, or is there something else that archaeology has been telling us that helps us understand what is in the Bible? Because the Bible, it gives us, in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it gives us very broad brushstrokes of what's occurring, but it doesn't give us a lot of detail. Another good example in the Tower of Babel, the idea that, Nimrod, was the leader of the rebellion. Well, if you look at chapter 11 and you look at those first 11 verses of chapter 11 and you read those verses carefully, Nimrod is never mentioned. In fact, every time when it talks about, building the tower and getting a name for ourselves, it's always a third person plural. We are going to do these things. Let us build a tower. In other words, it is a collective decision on the part of all of the people. They are all going to rebel. They did not need to follow the leader. They did not have to have a Nimrod to cause them to rebel. They all chose to rebel. And so you see that you see also then a third person, they, so it's not mentioning Nimrod. And so it's important to understand that Nimrod is only mentioned 4 times in the Bible, and 3 of those are all basically in the same chronology. And so all of the stuff that we've attached to Nimrod and we've attached to the Tower of Babel, it's mostly because of the legends in the book of Jasher that we believe these things about, that God came down, he swallowed up a third of the tower, a third of it was, burned up by fire, and only a third stands to this day. None of that's true. If you actually look at the ziggurats that are in Mesopotamia, you can go and you can actually find in the old city of Babylon, what was the Tower of Babel. And of course, it's not the same size as it's talked about in the book of Jasher and the legends about, it would take 3 days or whatever to walk around the outside. Not true. Herodotus gives us a lot of information about it. We know it was an incredibly important icon in the ancient world for almost 2,000 years. It's destroyed many times. It's rebuilt many times. And it is a symbol of the god Marduk, who is, in my opinion, based upon Nimrod. Right. But, so there's a lot that hangs together once you begin to rethink those stories in light of the chronology.
Yeah, but I wanted to point out in saying this that a lot of people are going to ask this question who are familiar with the topic of Nimrod. Then do you then disagree that all these different names for him are not right? And you don't say that at all. You actually say you have a subchapter or title in here is Gilgamesh, the mythical figure pointing to Nimrod.
Yeah.
That's a question for you. So
yes,
talk
that's right.
to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I do believe there's really two two personalities that archaeology suggests might be Nimrod. David Roll suggests that Gilgamesh probably is, and the details of the story in the Epic of Gilgamesh look pretty much like what we would think. Even the idea that Nimrod was part divine, that he began to be a giant or a Gibor in the Hebrew, that kind of fits into the Gilgamesh story as well, because he is a demigod. He is part Apkallu, to use the word that Michael Heiser has taught us, and he's part human. And then he has a friend named Enkidu, and Enkidu is a hybrid, a chimera. He's part beast and he's part man. And so you've got all these stories, and they're kind of wrapped up, and then the two of them go off to Canaan to fight this god named Hawawa, which is kind of like Yahweh. And so there's a lot of these factors that, you kind of go, wow, I can see how that legend got built up this way, and how Yahweh became the bad guy, and that somehow Gilgamesh is the good guy. The last figure is Sargon the First. Sargon the First, who was an emperor in the Akkadian time frame, was around 2200 BC. He also was suggested by those that believe that the flood occurred around 2350. They will point to Sargon as probably representative of Nimrod. But the problem is that even his life and the dates there even go slightly ahead of the supposed flood and Babylon and Nimrod and so forth. So it just doesn't fit, even though they tried to make it fit.
Right. So do you go into setting the biblical facts about Nimrod? All right, you make a first point. We need to make note that Nimrod is the son of Cush and the grandson of Ham.
Correct. That's correct. And so it's really confusing. That's why I provide quite a few charts to sort of help you understand and remember the names and who belongs to who, because it is very confusing. But it's important to do that so you can get the stories correct.
So this we already talked about. You're just rehashing the points, and I like to do this in here. The secondly is, it's not a foregone conclusion that the Tower of Babel happened right after the flood, nor is it likely that Nimrod led the rebellion, which you mentioned.
Right.
The third thing that you mentioned about setting the facts straight regarding Nimrod is, thirdly, we should discern that the story of the tower is the story of how the dispersal of humanity began.
Mm-hmm. It did begin there's some elements of it that if we go back to Genesis 10, we're going to read some things. It looks like Mizraim may have moved already towards Egypt, and that and he ultimately represents the clan of Set in the Egyptology, and that the Cushites ultimately become people of Horus, and in effect the Horus clan overtakes the Set clan. And you may remember in the mythology that Set becomes the bad guy, and Horus, who's the son of Osiris, Horus in effect defeats Set. And so the mythologies of Egypt begin to kind of fit into the story as well, once you get straight who is the father of whom, and when did they likely come into play, and how might they have influenced the mythology of Egypt. And so another thing, we may not have time to talk about tonight, but is the whole story of Nimrod's consort, Semiramis, and whether or not Semiramis was real. I argue that she wasn't. There, no doubt Nimrod had one or more queens, but Semiramis, despite what Alexander Hislop says, and I quote him quite a bit to kind of, pick apart some of the things that he says, Semiramis was probably fashioned after a queen from the 7th century BC, whose name was Semiramis was sort of part of her name. But she was a queen that led the Akkadian Empire for only a few years, and but they kind of attached a bunch of legends around her, and eventually she sort of becomes the consort of in effect Nimrod. All right, and
Mhm.
and so it's another part of the legend that sort of grows up. But Semiramis probably wasn't a real person in terms of coming from the 3000 BC or 2800 BC and as the consort to Nimrod. Probably not.
I don't know that you talk about this in this book or not, but when it comes to Nimrod, do you? I have come to believe that he did somehow corrupt himself and his DNA, perhaps with sacred knowledge. Do you believe that he did, in fact, discover or had been taught or was able to preserve knowledge through his lineage that helped him or bolstered him in some way, perhaps above
Well,
that of his brothers that spread out elsewhere?
yeah, I think that something truly happened to Nimrod. You know, we don't know exactly what it was. I think there's a lot of legends associated with it. Tom Horn suggests that he somehow became, he became a Gibor. He
Mhm.
became a gigantes in the Greek, a giant, and the legends tend to suggest that Gilgamesh was a giant. And
Mhm.
so something happened there. Now, what exactly happened, we don't know.
Right.
But it may have been a possession. But I think that he truly
I really don't.
became.
I really
He,
don't follow that line of just possession only. I myself personally, I
yeah, I understand, and I'm saying that something happened that was, we'll say, satanic, that occurred to him, and I tend to think that something occurred that was DNA, genetic. It's just that there's really no way to know other than just, it's like we have to be careful, strip away all the legends and just say, what does the Bible say? And could the interpretation of Gibor mean anything other than, a mighty one that was like the mighty ones, the sons of the angels, the Nephilim, and all that? And of course, there's other examples. David had mighty ones that I don't believe were giants.
Mhm.
The fact that Nimrod became a mighty one, it could only mean that he became the emperor of the world. It could only mean that, but I think there's something else there. So I tend to agree with you. I can't really, suggest that
Well,
anything more than the legends tend to suggest it, and the words of the Hebrew can kind of go along with it. But ultimately, we don't know. We do know that the angels descended on Hermon. And we know that I believe, like Heiser says in Reversing Hermon, that the angels came down on Mount Hermon, that they went into the daughters of men, that they had the Nephilim, and I believe all that. So that something like that happened with Nimrod. Yeah, yeah. I don't know exactly how it did, but it's very possible.
right. Well, here's the other thing. I think we're kind of held at bay in our thought process when it comes to the word hunter. If you look at the
Hmm.
reason, both for the Nimrod,
Hmm.
uh, in the Nimrod verses and those of David, as you pointed out, mighty hunters,
Right.
none of those are talking about fowl and deer.
Hmm.
Right? It's talking about what they accomplished was that of hunting down, defeating men.
That's
So
that is a that
I
is a
think
strong
our mind,
argument. Yeah, that's a strong argument. I wouldn't say that's proven either, but I would say that it's very probable.
yeah, but, I mean, it doesn't mention that they were. I mean, there's no reason to say hunter because they were good at chasing down fowl and feeding their
Right,
flock or the
right,
deer. The
right.
hunter connotation in these verses is both insinuating by the stories and the context that they're saying
Hmm.
they're feeding men. That's why
Well,
they're mighty
yeah.
hunter.
Remember, Hislop even argues, though, that it was the purpose of the kings of the Mesopotamian, both Sumer and Acadia, that one of their jobs was to hunt down the wild animals and to kill the wild animals.
Yeah, it just
You know,
you have to infer that. I think reading outside of the context, just
you,
solely from scripture.
you have to. My view is you have to infer either one.
Yeah,
Either one could be true. It's the question is, was he a hunter who was a giant, or was he a giant hunter?
Well,
So,
you know,
and I tend to think he was a giant. All right.
in either way, you're talking about hominid fashion creatures in my mind, solely from this scripture.
Something's going on there, and I think that is true. And of course, it leads into this whole discussion, which is a completely different show, which
Sure
is
I
are
have
the
you on
Nephilim
now.
back? Are they like back in black? Are they?
Well, you're on the show. It's kind of just really hard for me not to take advantage of bringing
Of
those kind of
course.
stuff.
Well, and I love this stuff. I love this.
I know you
Revelation
do. I know you do.
Yeah.
But,
So what I'm trying to do though is I'm really writing for those of us that are in this community that we're all kind of a part of. And there's 20, 30, 40,000 of us that really study prophecy. We're interested in, the stuff that L.A. Marzulli talks about, Steve Quayle, Tom Horn. So it's kind of a niche community, but it's still pretty big. And it does kind of bleed over into more standard fundamentalism, evangelicalism, whatever. But really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to clean up the mess that has been made by a lot of the legends that have come about regarding stuff that's in the book of Jasher. All right. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do, is trying to clean that up so that when we talk to secular people, we no longer have to hide from, the archaeology or the Egyptology. We can say, yes, the Bible supports that. You just have to understand it's the Septuagint chronology that we have to go to. And then we can have a dialogue about these persons and personalities and who was the Pharaoh of Moses and all that stuff.
Yeah, and believe it or not, Doug, the bottom line is that we've actually run out of time in our interview to begin.
Goes fast, doesn't it?
It broach probably another talking point out of this chapter and give it sufficient time for explanation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My point again is, as I've restated at the beginning, is that Doug's work is worth an honest read. It's worth looking at what he's written, look at what he's referenced, give it an honest read, and perhaps you two might have your mind changed about some things you thought before. At the very least, it will be another reference that you will have to hold up in consideration when looking at perhaps other information that somebody has written, at the very least.
Yeah, I like to tell people that I'm not a liberal. I believe, in the inspiration of the scriptures. I believe in Noah. I believe in the flood. I believe in Adam and Eve as historical figures. And this book will explain all those things. But there's still a lot of mess around the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis that the chronology of the Septuagint can help us get right. And that's really the thrust of Rebooting the Bible Part 2.
Yeah, so if you want to find more on Doug Woodward, my brother here, you go to that website that's scrolling across the bottom of your screen now. That's faith-happens.com. You will find information. Doomsday Doug, he's still around as that. Other places, I know he's not so much promoting as Doomsday Doug these days, but
I'm waiting for the coronavirus to become more
right.
But
you can still find him there. But the whole point of these interviews, as I've said before, we're ending the show on. Go to the Daily Renegade, go to Josh Peck's website, find the donate button, and show your love and support for him. I really enjoyed, Doug, having you on again, and I certainly believe that should the Lord tarry, you will in fact be on again. I keep saying this every time. I have yet to get an interview on you on the book that on Mars. On Mars.
I know. I'd love to talk about that book.
One of these days, I will get to interview you on that. Here's the problem. You're the problem, Doug. You keep writing new books.
I know.
I have to talk to you. So somewhere along the line, triple you up, quadruple you up.
Well, I say that my goal is that I try to write a book faster than you can read it. So
far you're succeeding. I did pretty good with Rebooting the Bible Part 1.
Yes, you did.
I may be doing pretty good with this one as well, but
wait till you read about Peleg. I opened the book with Peleg, and I'll blow people's mind.
Well, that'll be very interesting to do. My name is Chad Schaefer. This is Disputed Lands on Take on the World TV. stick around. There's going to be another hour after this one, I'm pretty sure. Matter of fact, I'm absolutely 100% sure. Maybe the next one that will be on after you is L.A. Marzulli himself, Doug. So
tell him I said hi.
All right. We'll talk to you guys later. Till we see you next time. Bye now.
Get right, get inside, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey. Get right, get inside, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey. Get right, get inside.